For 4 months, these men had been trying to kill each other. Then, on one freezing night in December 1914, something happened that no general ordered, and no historian can fully explain. Soldiers climbed out of their trenches, unarmed, walking straight toward the enemy they'd been shooting at hours earlier. By morning, men who were paid to kill each other were playing football in no man's land. This is the story of the only time in modern warfare that soldiers stopped a war on their own, and why it never happened again. In the summer of 1914, Europe went to war. Almost every soldier who marched off believed the same thing: home by Christmas. It was one of the most confident predictions in military history, and it was completely wrong. By December, the war hadn't ended. It had frozen, literally and figuratively. Both sides had dug hundreds of miles of trenches, stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Neither side could advance. Neither side would retreat. The conditions were brutal. Soldiers stood for weeks in freezing mud and standing water. In some places, opposing trenches were less than 50 meters apart. Men could hear their enemies coughing, singing, even arguing at night. That proximity mattered more than anyone expected. These weren't distant, faceless enemies anymore. They were voices in the dark, and voices are hard to hate. On the night of December 24th, something strange started happening up and down the front, independently, in dozens of places, with no coordination between them. German soldiers set up small Christmas trees along their trench lines and lit them with candles. Then they began to sing, Stille Nacht, Silent Night. British soldiers, hearing the melody drift across no man's land, answered back in English with the same carol. No officer gave an order. No treaty was signed. It started with soldiers simply refusing to shoot at a Christmas tree. One British soldier wrote home describing German voices shouting, "Merry Christmas!" across the wire, and then, unbelievably, climbing out of their trenches unarmed to prove they meant it. What began as caution, everyone assuming it was a trap, slowly turned into something neither side expected: contact. On Christmas morning, thousands of soldiers walked out into the most dangerous strip of land in Europe, the shell-torn, corpse-littered ground between the trenches known as no man's land. This wasn't isolated. It happened at hundreds of separate points along the front, at roughly the same time, without any of the units communicating with each other. What did they do? They shook hands. Enemies introduced themselves, traded names. They exchanged gifts, cigarettes, brandy, Christmas pudding, buttons off their own uniforms. They took photographs. A handful of these images survive today. They buried their dead. Men who had lain unburied for days were finally given a proper burial, by both sides, together. And then, the detail that made this story famous, they played football. Historians still argue about the exact details: how many matches were played, what the final scores were, whether some accounts were exaggerated after the fact. But dozens of independent letters and diaries describe the same basic scene. Soldiers used empty ration tins or actual footballs, with helmets stacked up as makeshift goalposts, playing on frozen, cratered ground that had been a battlefield the day before. One German officer later recalled that the match was surprisingly organized, that the British and Germans agreed on rules, played a full game, and that Germany won. The image says everything the war itself couldn't. Men who had orders to kill each other were now laughing together on the same patch of dirt. These soldiers hadn't chosen to be enemies. Governments had made that choice for them. For a few hours, they set that choice aside and chose their shared humanity instead. The truce wasn't universal, and where it did happen, it didn't last the same length of time everywhere. In some sectors, it lasted a single day. In others, it stretched all the way to New Year's. But High Command reacted almost immediately, and with alarm. Officers on both sides saw this kind of fraternization as dangerous. If soldiers started seeing the enemy as human beings, they might stop being willing to kill them. So orders came down. Truces were banned. Officers were told to monitor their men closely. Soldiers were warned that any repeat of this friendliness would be treated as a serious violation. By the following Christmas, and every Christmas after, nothing on this scale ever happened again. The Christmas Truce is often told as a feel-good story, and in many ways it is. But it's also more complicated than that. This moment reveals a few uncomfortable truths: the humanity of ordinary soldiers. Even men trapped in one of history's bloodiest wars could recognize their shared experience.
The moment they were given the chance. The gap between institutions and individuals. Governments decide to go to war. The people who actually fight it often don't carry the same hatred. Why wars keep going anyway? Even after soldiers connected as human beings, the machinery around them, orders, politics, nationalism, kept the war running. The truce didn't stop the war. Within days, in some cases, the very same men who had shaken hands were shooting at each other again. That's perhaps the most tragic part of this story. The men who played football together may have gone on to kill each other or been killed themselves before the war finally ended, 4 bloody years later. The Christmas Truce of 1914 is often called a miracle inside a war. But maybe it's better understood as proof of exactly how much power war holds. The power to force ordinary people to set aside their natural compassion for each other. For a few hours, on one Christmas day, that power broke down. More than a century later, this story is still told, not just because it's about war, but because it's about hope, and about how even in the darkest circumstances, people can still choose to connect. If you found this story as remarkable as we did, subscribe, and hit the bell for more forgotten moments history almost forgot to tell.